Salvete Discipoli. Today we have a very short, primarily historical lesson, and you get to see me face to face, so this should be really exciting. I've also upped the quality on the video, so we will see if it's less blurry this time. But that is all you get to see of me, so bye. And today's lesson is on a guy by the name of Catullus. And you see a contemporary bust of him right here. Good-looking guy, I suppose. He's fairly young, and we'll talk about that. We're actually going back in time here, though. So we basically took history all the way up to the end of the Julio-Claudian emperors. That ended with Nero in the year 69, and that's the end of that Julio-Claudian dynasty. We're now going to go back in time to study Catullus, who lived in the time of Julius Caesar. There's a reason we're doing this, and I'll talk more about that at the end of this presentation. But trust me, there's a reason. So let's talk about this guy, Catullus. His full name is Gaius Valerius Catullus. He lived from 84 BC to 54 BC, we think. Okay, this is one of those poets where we have very little information on his life, in fact, which is going to make this presentation very short. And in fact, we're not even 100% sure that he died in 54. We just know that he disappears from the records. We don't hear anything about him historically after 54. But by the same token, we don't hear any information on how he died or if we're even certain if that's when he died. So we just don't know. He was born in Verona, which is in northern Italy. So once again, you see this theme. Okay, think about it for a second. You know, I've talked about it a lot. This is an example of a guy who's born outside of Rome, but has so much talent that he goes to Rome to make his fortune, to make a name for himself. We know only a little bit about Catullus's family. We're pretty darn sure that they were wealthy. And the main reason we believe that is because we know that Julius Caesar visited his family on a number of occasions for dinner, to socialize, etc. The assumption is Caesar would not be visiting the family of a poor person, so we assume that Catullus' family had to be fairly wealthy. It's also interesting, too, because we're going to talk about, in a second, Catullus' relationship with Caesar. At the age of 20, Catullus goes to Rome. Okay, and as you can see from his dates up here, he may have only lived around 30 years, so you know, he might have, at this point, have been 2/3 of the way through his life. So at the age of 20, he goes to Rome. So he'd been through most of his education at this point. He ends up serving in Bithynia, which is basically north of modern-day Turkey, so it's in the east. Served there as a governor. On the governor's staff in 57 BC. So he was involved in politics just a little bit. But it's very clear from his writing and from the fact that he didn't do anything more in politics that he had a great distaste for politics. He is known to have criticized the triumvirate and to have criticized Julius Caesar himself. Interesting, because again, we know that Caesar had visited his family and they were kind of friends. There's a lot of evidence, though, to suggest that he did not have a long-standing feud with Caesar, and even though he criticized Caesar, Caesar did not seem to have any major problem with it. So, what did this Catullus guy actually do? Catullus was a poet. He was one of the guys that our hero Cicero referred to as the novi poetae. Remember, for the Romans, the word novus, which just means new, usually has a negative connotation. Okay, remember Christianity to the Romans was referred to as a nova religio, a new religion. The Romans were suspicious of it. Remember the phrase novi res, new things means revolution. Okay, the Romans are generally conservative, and anything that is described as novus usually has a negative connotation. So Cicero, to criticize this group of poets that Catullus was in, called them the novi poetae. Another term for them is the neoterics. This is the term scholars usually use. These are some poets who essentially rejected Roman ideals in favor of Greek ones. They follow a tradition started by a woman named Sappho. I think we've talked about Sappho before. She was a Greek poetess. She lived on the island of Lesbos. And of course, we get the term lesbian from her because many people believe that she was homosexual. She came from the island of Lesbos, hence a lesbian, a person from that island originally, all right, was related to Sappho, and therefore a lesbian is a gay woman. In fact, we don't know for sure if Sappho was homosexual or not. At any rate, Catullus writes following her tradition. We'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but remember this name, remember Sappho. He also writes in the tradition of the Alexandrian poets. These are obviously poets from around the area in Egypt, okay, from Alexandria. They are not writing in the typical Roman style. Okay, this is a different style. He's using different meters, okay, using different rhythms in his poetry. He's writing about different things than the Romans typically write about. This is why he gets the name Novi Poetae from Cicero. Okay, he is not following the normal Roman tradition. He ultimately, in his poetry, is going to reject Stoic ideas. Okay, Sappho did the same sort of thing. Sappho rejected the typical poetry of the day, the typical poetry of the Greeks. Okay, the Alexandrian poets did it to a degree as well. But you'll definitely see in Catullus a rejection of a lot of the Stoic ideas that we talked about with Cicero to some extent, with Seneca for sure, and with Horace in his ode about the fall of Cleopatra. In fact, Catullus wrote very little that we still have. He has basically one volume of work. It's about 114 poems long, so there's a lot of poems, but that's all we have of his work. If you ever wanted to go out and buy it, it's a very small volume with you can get a really neat edition that has English on one side, Latin on the other. It's good stuff. Some of his works are translations. In fact, some of them are direct translations of Sappho. Okay, some of them are translations of some of the Alexandrian poets. All right, he was not ashamed of this, nor were people pointing a finger at him and saying, "You're a plagiarist." This is just how they did it in the ancient world. He took great Greek poems and put them into Latin, and the people were impressed by it. And this is no small feat, because when he did this, he would fit them to the same rhythm in Latin that they were in Greek, which is very difficult to do. At the same time, many of his poems are originals, are ones that he wrote himself, okay, on topics that might be related to stuff Sappho and the Alexandrian poets wrote about, but they are original to Catullus. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about here is a woman by the name of Lesbia. This is the woman that Catullus writes a lot of his poetry about and sometimes to. Okay, this is his big love interest. He calls this woman Lesbia. Now, he calls her Lesbia to pay tribute to Sappho, because remember, Sappho is from the island of Lesbos. So he names this woman Lesbia to say, hey, I respect Sappho. Okay? Now, we don't know for a fact who this woman is. All right? We don't know for a fact if Lesbia is referring to a real Roman woman. But we think that maybe Lesbia is referring to Clodia, who was the sister of Clodius. You guys might remember Clodius, the arch rival of Cicero, if you will, the guy who got Cicero exiled, the guy who was reputed to have an incestuous relationship with his sister Clodia. Remember, Clodia was considered by many to be one of the most beautiful women in all of Rome. She was extremely intelligent, extremely seductive, and it's quite possible that Catullus was one of the men that fell for her and then ended up writing poetry about her, but calling her Lesbia. Long story short, we don't know for sure, but it's nice to keep this possible explanation in mind. So, that is really the bulk of what I want to talk about today. The one thing I just want you to keep in mind as we go into Catullus, as we begin reading Catullus, is we are jumping back in time to the time of Caesar so that we can see Catullus and then this other poet Ovid who wrote under Augustus. we can see these guys sort of give an answer to Stoic thought. Okay? We saw what Cicero valued, and a lot of what he valued was Stoic. We saw what Seneca valued. He was obviously Stoic. We saw what Horace, to some extent, valued. To some extent. Okay? Now we're going to see a response. We're going to see in Catullus and Ovid a response that says, Stoicism is not the way to go. Okay? Being hyper concerned about doing your duty is not the way to happiness. Okay? So keep that in mind as we begin to read Catullus. That is all for today. Valete.